Ronald Reagan's arrival on the political stage was less a policy debut and more a cultural event. He was not a lifelong public servant, a legal scholar, or a wonk with a portfolio of legislative achievements. Instead, he came as a familiar presence from the nation's television screens and cinema reels, a man whose face and voice already carried built-in trust for millions of Americans. His years in Hollywood had taught him how to deliver a line, how to make eye contact that seemed personal, even through a camera lens, and how to project warmth while selling an idea. By the time he declared his candidacy for governor in 1966, Reagan had already perfected the art of playing one of us, even when speaking from a stage built for the powerful. California, when Reagan stepped into the political arena, was a state brimming with contradictions. It was the most populous and economically dynamic state in the nation, boasting high-tech innovation, a booming post-war manufacturing sector, and the best-funded public university system in America. But under the bright surface ran deep undercurrents of unrest. Racial tensions had exploded in Watts in 1965, exposing the gulf between the prosperity of white suburbs and the poverty of black and brown urban neighborhoods. The Vietnam War was escalating, and with it came student protests, draft resistance, and a generational rejection of the political establishment. Inflation and rising property taxes were squeezing homeowners, while the new wave of immigration was changing the cultural fabric of cities. For many Californians, particularly white, middle, and working class families, the pace of change felt overwhelming, even threatening. Reagan understood this fear intuitively, and he understood how to speak to it without sounding harsh or overly reactionary. He wrapped his message in the comforting language of shared values, hard work, personal responsibility, patriotism, and the sanctity of law and order. He told blue-collar families that he saw their struggles. He knew they were playing by the rules in a world that seemed to be abandoning those rules. He did not dismiss their grievances as selfish or parochial. He elevated them as the moral core of the state. In doing so, he offered what felt like clarity in a time of chaos. Central to his pitch was the idea of the silent majority, a phrase that suggested not only that his audience was large, but that it had been ignored or disrespected by the political and cultural elites. These were the people who felt the world was moving too fast, the homeowners who saw their property taxes climbing, the union machinists who resented campus radicals, the small business owners frustrated by regulation, the parents alarmed at the erosion of traditional moral values. Reagan made himself their translator, speaking their unease in a plain-spoken, almost avuncular style that was worlds apart from the clipped patrician tones of East Coast politicians. He cultivated an anti-establishment image, even though much of his career had been spent within elite networks, first in Hollywood's studio system, then as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and later as a corporate spokesman for General Electric. His campaign was careful to frame him not as a man of the boardroom, but a man who had walked away from the comfortable celebrity to answer a civic calling. The role he played in politics was a familiar one to anyone who had seen him on screen. The decent, principled everyman, stepping forward when the community was in trouble. But there was another side to the story. Reagan's ascent was not a spontaneous uprising of grassroots sentiment. It was nurtured, funded, and strategically guided by a coalition of California's most influential corporate and conservative power brokers. Agribusiness magnates, real estate developers, oil companies, and manufacturing giants saw in Reagan a rare talent, a man who could deliver their economic agenda with a smile, disarm opposition with humor, and frame policies that favored capital as acts of common-sense governance. The financial muscle behind his campaign came from the very strata of society whose fortunes depended on curbing the power of organized labor, slowing the expansion of public services, and keeping student and civil rights movements in check. To working class voters, Reagan's promise sounded like a restoration of fairness and order. To his backers, they were the blueprint for a different kind of restoration, one that would dismantle the gains made by unions in the post-war years, redirect tax policy in favor of private wealth, and erode the influence of public institutions that had been the engines of social mobility. Sound familiar? In effect, Reagan was offering two messages at once, one to the public rooted in cultural reassurance, and one to his donors rooted in economic realignment. The genius of his campaign was that the two never seemed to conflict. What Reagan was really selling was not just a leader for a moment of instability, but a shift in the balance of power itself, away from labor and toward capital, away from shared prosperity and toward privatized wealth. His genius lay in making that shift feel, to many working people, like it was in their own interest. One of Ronald Reagan's first serious tests as governor came not from the legislature or the courts, but from California's own workforce. By the mid-1960s, the state's public sector unions, representing teachers, civil servants, and other government employees, had grown into a formidable political force. The post-war boom years had seen steady wage gains, stronger pensions, and increased job security for these workers, the result of decades of careful organizing and incremental legislative wins. For many Californians, these jobs represented the closest thing to an economic safety net: steady income, reliable benefits, and protection from arbitrary dismissal. To the workers, this was the reward for years of advocacy and solidarity. To Reagan, however, it looked like an entrenched class of bureaucrats feeding off the public purse. The same benefits that made these jobs secure and dignified their holders appeared to Reagan as signs of inefficiency and government bloat. And because private sector unions were often politically aligned with liberal and progressive causes, Reagan also saw them as ideological adversaries, a permanent constituency for big government funded by taxpayer dollars. This confrontation came to a head in 1967, just months after Reagan took office, when the California legislature passed a bill granting public school teachers the right to collectively bargain over wages, benefits, and working conditions. For teachers, many of whom already belonged to professional associations or unions, this was the culmination of a long struggle to be recognized not as subordinate employees, but as professionals with a voice in how their schools were run. The bill had widespread support among educators and labor leaders, but it also faced fierce opposition from business groups, conservative lawmakers, and anti-union activists. Reagan vetoed the bill outright. His official justification rested on fiscal concerns. The state could not, he argued, afford the cost increases that would inevitably come from negotiation with organized teachers. He warned that granting collective bargaining rights would hand public employees too much power over the taxpayer's dollar. Yet, beneath the rhetoric of prudence was a deeper ideological motive. Reagan had built his political career on the idea that government was the problem, not the solution. If public employees gained the same bargaining power as private sector workers, it would undermine his argument that government was inherently inefficient. In his worldview, empowering public sector unions meant empowering the very machine he was promising to dismantle. Rather than seeking compromise, Reagan doubled down on confrontation. When teachers staged walkouts or public demonstrations, his administration responded with legal threats and punitive measures. State agencies were instructed to resist union demands, and school districts were quietly encouraged to discipline or dismiss outspoken labor activists. By doing so, Reagan sent a clear signal. The governor's office would not be a neutral arbiter in labor disputes. It would actively work to weaken organized labor's influence. This approach went beyond the education sector. State employees in a range of departments, from transportation to social services, found themselves facing budget freezes, staff reductions, and a hostile negotiating climate. Reagan positioned himself as the protector of the taxpayer, casting public employees as a privileged class whose demands came at the expense of ordinary families. It was a shrewd bit of political framing, because many of these ordinary families included public employees themselves. The tactic divided the working class into two camps: those who received paychecks from the state and those who didn't. By pitting them against each other, Reagan diluted the potential for solidarity between public and private sector workers. The divide and conquer strategy was highly effective. Business groups and fiscal conservatives applauded his resolve, seeing in him a defender against what they perceived as union excess. The popular press often echoed his framing, portraying strikes as selfish disruptions and budget disputes as proof that government workers were out of touch with economic reality. Meanwhile, the public sector unions, stripped of political allies in the governor's office, were forced into a defensive posture, fighting simply to maintain what they had already won. In the short term, Reagan's war on public sector labor curbed union influence in Sacramento. In the long term, it established a model for conservative governance that would be replicated at the national level during his presidency, refused to negotiate on labor rights, framed public employees as an economic burden, and rallied non-union workers against them. The strategy wasn't about cutting costs. It was about shifting the balance of power. Each defeat for organized labor made it easier to redirect public resources away from wages and benefits and toward the private sector, reinforcing the alliance between political leaders and corporate backers. For Reagan's supporters, this was proof of his fiscal discipline. For his critics, it was an early warning of the economic realignment to come, one in which the gains of the post-war middle class would be steadily eroded, not by accident, but by design. If organized labor was one adversary in Reagan's political landscape, the university campus was another, and in many ways, the more visible and emotionally charged one. By the mid-1960s, California's university system had become the envy of the nation. The Master Plan for Higher Education, implemented in 1960, guaranteed tuition-free access to higher education for qualified California students, and created a tiered system of community colleges, state universities, and the University of California campuses. It was a public investment in human capital on a scale unmatched anywhere in the United States, and it fueled both economic growth and social mobility. But it also produced something Reagan's political instincts told him could be turned into a potent enemy: an environment in which young people were not only educated, but encouraged to think critically about the society they lived in, and increasingly to organize against it. By the early 1960s, the Berkeley campus had become ground zero of the free speech movement, where students demanded the right to advocate for civil rights, oppose segregation, and later protest the Vietnam War. Sit-ins, teach-ins, and mass demonstrations were frequent, and they challenged not just university policies, but the authority of the state itself. To many Californians watching on television, these scenes looked chaotic, even dangerous. Young people shouting in the microphones, facing off against police, occupying administrative buildings. It seemed a world apart from the quiet, obedient classrooms of their own youth. Reagan, ever the skilled performer, recognized the political opportunity in these optics. He didn't have to convince voters that campuses were unruly. The nightly news was doing that for him. What he could do was position himself as the man who would restore order. In his 1966 gubernatorial campaign, Reagan made the promise explicit. He would clean up the mess at Berkeley. This was more than a slogan. It was a calculated signal to voters that he would stand firm against what they perceived as the moral and political drift of the younger generation. to working-class parents, many of whom were making sacrifices to send their children to these universities. It suggested their investment was being squandered on indoctrination and anarchy. Once in office, Reagan acted quickly. He targeted higher education budgets, cutting funding for the University of California system, and pressing for tuition or fees that had never existed before. These cuts not only strained the university's resources, but also struck at the heart of the master plan's promise: an affordable education for all Californians. He challenged the autonomy of the university's governance, pressuring the Board of Regents to take a harder line against campus dissent, and replacing members with allies who shared his hostility towards student activism. The confrontations soon escalated. At Berkeley and other campuses, anti-war demonstrations, civil rights protests, and labor solidarity actions brought students into direct conflict with administrators and police. Reagan's response was forceful and highly visible. State law enforcement and, in some cases, the National Guard were deployed to disperse gatherings, clear occupied buildings, and arrest protest leaders. In May 1969, during the People's Park conflict in Berkeley, a dispute over whether an unused university lot should be turned into a community park, his administration authorized a crackdown that left one student dead, dozens injured, and hundreds arrested. Tear gas drifted through residential neighborhoods. The city resembled a military occupation. Reagan's reaction to these events was not that of a reluctant leader forced into unpleasant measures. He relished the confrontation. The more intense the protests, the more he could frame himself as the champion of law-abiding citizens against the forces of disorder. His speeches during this period portrayed student activists as spoiled products of privilege, children of the middle class and affluent families who, instead of being grateful for their opportunities, were intent on tearing down a society that had given them so much. The fact that many protesters came from working-class backgrounds or were themselves veterans of the civil rights movement was erased in the telling. The genius of this political framing was that it turned student dissent into a symbolic threat to the values of middle America. By vilifying protesters, Reagan turned the campuses into cultural battlefields, where he could fight and win in the realm of public opinion. Each clash was an opportunity to reinforce his broader narrative, that permissive liberalism had let society slip into chaos, and only firm conservative leadership could restore discipline and respect for authority. But the cost of this strategy was immense. Academic freedom, already fragile in moments of political tension, was narrowed under the pressure of political scrutiny and funding threats. The introduction and steady rise of tuition fees began in this era, eroding the master plan's ideal of tuition-free access and setting in motion a decades-long trend toward the commodification of higher education. As a side note, my first semester at a California community college in 1980 cost $5 for the health fee. I never went to the clinic, so I don't know what was available. A few years later, it was hundreds of dollars per course, which made it unaffordable for a lot of us. I guess that was the point, though, right? Faculty, wary of attracting political ire, sometimes pulled back from controversial research or public commentary. Students learned that activism came with risks, not just of arrest, but of expulsion and a permanent mark on their records. In the end, Reagan's battle with California's universities was not merely about cleaning up unrest. It was about redefining the purpose of public higher education itself, from a public good designed to create engaged citizens, to a controlled pipeline for the workforce, stripped of its more politically disruptive potential. The campuses had been a proving ground for a generation's social movements. Under Reagan, they became a proving ground for a new kind of cultural politics, one that used fear of youth, dissent, and intellectual independence as tools to consolidate political power. What emerged from this confrontation was a lasting template, Politicians could score points with anxious voters by attacking universities as hotbeds of radicalism, even when those attacks eroded the very institutions that made social mobility possible. For Reagan, it was an early masterclass in turning cultural anxiety into political capital, and an enduring chapter in the myth of a strong leader defending the people from disorder. Reagan's political genius, if genius is the right word, lay in his ability to maintain a seamless tension between what he said and what he did. His public persona was that of a plain-spoken defender of the little guy, a man who understood the struggles of working families and wanted to protect them from waste, disorder, and moral decay. But behind the scenes, the policies he championed consistently strengthened the position of those already at the top, often at direct cost to the people that he claimed to represent. He told union workers that he respected the dignity of labor, even as he blocked legislation that would have expanded collective bargaining rights, and used the machinery of state government to weaken their negotiating power. Public sector unions, teachers, municipal workers, civil servants, were painted as self-interested elites whose demands burdened the taxpayer. The narrative was carefully crafted. Organized labor wasn't a community of workers fighting for fair wages. It was a special interest group exploiting the system. In this framing, Reagan could gut union influence while claiming to defend the real working class from parasitism. The same pattern played out on the campuses. He told students and parents that he valued freedom of expression and the open exchange of ideas, invoking the democratic principles of debate and dialogue. Yet, when those ideas turned into organized dissent against war, racism, or economic inequality, he deployed police, state troopers, and the National Guard to shut them down. The message was that free speech was acceptable only so long as it was polite, non-disruptive, and non-threatening to the political status quo. Activism that challenged power was recast as chaos, subversion, and even criminality. On fiscal matters, Reagan's balancing act was just as deft. He assured the public that he would be a careful steward of the budget, cutting waste and avoiding unnecessary spending. In practice, waste often meant social programs that benefited the poor, the elderly, or working families. Services that had once been the pride of California's post-war model of shared prosperity. At the same time, spending on law enforcement and prison expansion rose sharply. The state's penal system, already among the most extensive in the country, grew even more muscular under his watch, reflecting his conviction that social disorder was best solved through punishment rather than prevention. The beneficiaries of the shift were not the blue-collar voters who cheered his calls for discipline and thrift. They were California's business leaders, large land developers, and agribusiness interests. Reagan's administration rewarded them with tax breaks, regulatory rollbacks, and targeted subsidies. Land use rules were relaxed to favor real estate development. Water policies tilted toward the needs of large-scale agriculture over environmental or small farm concerns. Environmental protections were resisted when they threatened industrial growth. These measures were justified as pro-growth policies that would lift all boats. But the economic tides they stirred lifted yachts far more than fishing boats. Perhaps Reagan's most remarkable skill was in making these shifts feel like victories for the very people they disadvantaged. He framed cuts to education not as a withdrawal from the state's commitment to public opportunity, but as a necessary step to encourage self-reliance and keep families responsible for their children's futures. He cast the weakening of unions as a liberation for workers, freeing them from the supposedly oppressive grip of labor bosses and, higher wages. He portrayed the crackdown on protests as essential to keeping neighborhoods safe for law-abiding citizens. This wasn't mere spin. It was a form of political judo, using the weight of people's anxieties and resentments to turn them against their own institutional defenders. A working-class parent, worried about rising taxes and unnerved by images of campus unrest, could be persuaded that slashing university budgets was an act of fiscal common sense. A taxpayer, frustrated with bureaucratic inefficiency, could be convinced that stripping teachers of bargaining rights was a way to improve schools. A homeowner, fearful of urban crime, could see expanding police and prisons as a logical solution without recognizing that those same budgets were draining funds from the infrastructure, education, and social programs that kept communities healthy in the long term. What made this double game so effective was Reagan's personal style. He didn't come across as coldly calculating or overtly ideological. He was genial, self-deprecating, and skilled at telling stories that humanized his political positions. A quip about government inefficiency or a lighthearted anecdote about hard work could mask the fact that the policies behind the words were redistributing wealth and power upward. His ability to merge warmth and firmness made it easy for people to believe that even painful cuts or controversial crackdowns were, in the end, for their own good. In the broader arc of California's political history, this approach marked a turning point. The post-war consensus that embraced strong public institutions, progressive taxation, and broad-based prosperity began to erode under the weight of Reagan's rhetoric and policy. The new governing philosophy placed more trust in markets than in government, more faith in punishment than in social investment, and more priority on the needs of business than on the collective welfare. The shift was not sold as a transfer of power to the wealthy, because it never is, but as a restoration of balance, responsibility, and common sense. Reagan didn't just punch down. He got the people being hit to cheer while he did it. That was the true brilliance of the double game. To make the dismantling of protections, institutions, and rights feel like an act of defense rather than aggression. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for a political style that would dominate American conservatism for decades. A style in which contradictions between message and method were not weaknesses to be concealed, but engines of power to be harnessed. By the time Reagan stepped away from the governor's desk in 1975, he had done far more than govern California. He had authored a political playbook. It was a manual for how to speak the language of the working class while methodically eroding the foundations of their economic security. And the brilliance of it, from a purely strategic perspective, was that it didn't require elaborate deception. The agenda wasn't hidden in smoke-filled rooms. It was performed, loudly, in front of the cameras. But it was draped in the comforting fabrics of common sense and fiscal responsibility, making it feel like the natural order of things. Reagan understood that people could be persuaded to vote against their own material interests if they believed the sacrifice was virtuous. He offered not a policy program, but a moral narrative. That thrift was patriotic, that dissent was disorder, and that public spending on the vulnerable was an indulgence the state could no longer afford. It was a masterstroke in reframing structural changes. Deep cuts, privatization, anti-union policies, not as acts of aggression against the working class, but as acts of moral restoration. He pioneered a rhetorical sleight of hand. Austerity was recast as discipline. Deregulation as freedom. Inequality as the inevitable result of individual effort. In this telling, the struggling worker was not the victim of systemic shifts in capital and labor, but of his own shortcomings, or of a parasitic special interest siphoning away his hard-earned wages. And those special interests were defined broadly enough to include the very people, teachers, public servants, university students, whose rights and wages were under direct assault. The divisions he fostered were not incidental. They were the glue that held the whole project together. Parents were taught to distrust teachers. Students were portrayed as ungrateful and dangerous. Public employees became bureaucrats rather than neighbors or fellow citizens. Taxpayers were pitted against the recipients of public services, as though they are separate tribes locked in a zero-sum contest. These fractures didn't just serve Reagan's short-term political goals. They laid the emotional and ideological groundwork for the conservative resurgence that would dominate national politics for the next generation or two. The myth of Reagan as the steadfast protector of the common man hardened in the political folklore, repeated in campaign ads, nostalgic biographies, and friendly press interviews. But the historical record tells a more sober story. This was a governor who presided over and actively engineered the upward transfer of wealth and power, who broke the spine of public sector unions, who turned California's once proud system of public investment into a proving ground for a neoliberal experiment. The fault lines he carved into the state's political culture never healed. They deepened, widened, and eventually ran across the entire national landscape. In the decades that followed, politicians of both parties would draw on the Reagan template, claim the mantle of the working class while praising policies that enriched the donor class, speak of unity while stoking resentment between factions of the working poor. Reagan left Sacramento with his popularity intact and his political future bright. But the California he left behind was less equal, less united, and far less committed to the notion that public goods belong to everyone. And the working man, who thought he had found a champion, had been enlisted, willingly, even enthusiastically, into dismantling his own protections. History, unburdened by campaign slogans, recorded this not as an accident, but as the point of the exercise.